Hello, I'm Nathan. Welcome back to my series on ancient and historic games. Today the game I'm talking about is Senet, which is an ancient Egyptian board game thought to possibly be the oldest board game for which we have evidence and possibly rules. Senet translates from its original language to passing, uh, referencing the passage of the soul through the underworld, or also possibly the passage of the sun through the underworld, which in Egyptian mythology it was thought to undertake each evening overnight so it could rise again over the earth the next day. So already you can see this is a game that had mythological and cultural significance, but I'll get into the depths of that a little bit later. The reason we say it's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, board game known is because specific evidence of its existence and play has been found dating back to at least 3100 BCE. That is, when the earliest reference found in hieroglyphics was discovered. And I'll reference hieroglyphs again because they're actually found on the game board, but there's also a hieroglyph, the sound mn, that is thought to be a depiction of a Senet board on its side, with the pawns sticking up on the game board. That gives you an idea of how deeply this is tied into the culture too. Other examples of artifacts found date from 3,000 to 5,000 years old, which include entire game boards, which were often rectangular boxes with a sliding lid, the game board on the top of the lid, and the components, pawns and throwing sticks, I'll discuss in a moment, found inside, so the complete game set. One of the most beautiful examples found, and I'm told is in a museum, was actually found in the tomb of King Tutankhamun, one of the well-known pharaohs. However, there are other boards of different types, different materials, gold, sometimes stone, sometimes wood, found in other tombs of kings and other nobles. There have also been more crude boards found scratched into walls and furnishings, depictions of the game in play in paintings, and descriptions of its play or references to it in written literature. So there's a lot of different evidence sources. Unfortunately, none of them contain a complete set of rules. Scholars have just done the best they can to reconstruct the game. Now, how do they know that the game that they're seeing is specifically Senet? Well, there is the pieces of the game. And particularly, I mentioned the board. It's pretty distinctive. This is my hand-drawn board created for a festival and a discussion of ancient games. So you can see the board has 30 squares, 3 rows of 10 squares each. And it follows a zigzag pattern. So the first square being here in the corner, going left and right, 1 through 10, down again, up to 20, right to left, and then down on the bottom row, left to right again to square 30. And several of the squares are marked with symbols, which in this board, in this reconstruction, are hieroglyphs, as was the case in some sets, marking specific squares or houses. And these are special squares that have different effects. Other boards had different squares marked, although they tended to cluster toward the bottom row, the end of the track. And they use different symbols, sometimes abstract, sometimes hieroglyphs of different types. But that general pattern tends to mark out a Senet board. Also, there were pawns playing pieces, which were either of different colors, 2 different colors, there were 2 players, 2 different shapes, and usually there was a lighter and a darker, or a shorter and a taller set. I'm just using glass counters, blue and orange for my set. And there were typically between 5 and 11 pawns per side. Now, as you can see from the board, this is a race type of game, and it's referred to as one of a family called dice and track games. That is, the movement of those pawns across the racetrack was controlled by the throw of dice and the choices of the players, but there was a random number element. Now, ancient Egypt didn't have the cubic 6-sided dice that we're used to, or other types of geometric solids. Those were invented elsewhere and other times. However, what they used for random number generation were throwing sticks. And I've just used popsicle sticks for my set, but you can see one side is marked, one side is blank. And so these were thrown into the air to land however they would. And if they landed with the marked side up, that would count it as a 1, a roll or a flip of 1. On the blank side is 0, and there were 4 sticks. So if none of them turned up, that would be a 0. You could have 1, 2, or 3 sticks turned up for rolls of 1, 2, or 3. And if all marked sides turned up, that could be read as either a 5 or a 6. Again, depending on the rule variant that was being described. So there are some who interpret it each way. I mentioned with the sticks they could have a marked or unmarked side. More often what was found in sets was one side was white, one side black. And then they thought that the dark side would be the marked side. So those were the pieces more often found. I'm going to be playing in my version with a die and just subtracting 1 from the roll, so I get a number from 0 to 5. Now, Senet is thought to be one of a family of games, possibly an ancestor, possibly a parallel relative, of a number of games found in Northern Africa and the Middle East and surrounding regions. One of the others that is a competitor for the title of oldest board game is called the Royal Game of Ur, or the Game of 20 Squares. Artifacts with that board run about the same time frame. The distinction being that the proof of Senet is a slight bit older, but the known rules for the Royal Game of Ur are much better stated. So I'd like to actually talk about that game more in another video, so I'll leave it off there. But I do know that they were contemporaries because at least one artifact was found with both games on the same board. Remember I mentioned that these were a rectangular box? In this case, one side was Senet, the other side was the board for the Royal Game of Ur, which is also fairly distinctive. So the same set of pieces and throwing sticks could be used for both games. Another game that might have been played around the same time or even slightly later but still pretty ancient is the game of Hounds and Jackals, which was given its name by Howard Carter, who'd first discovered it in the tomb of King Tutankhamun. He was credited as the discoverer. He named it because of the animal heads carved onto the sticks used as the playing pieces, the pawns that moved around the board. There were pegs that fit into holes. Hounds and Jackals is also called the game of 58 squares because instead of one 30-square track, it had 2 parallel tracks of 29 squares each, or 58 in total. Now this movement of pegged along a pegboard, along track, may seem familiar, and some have suggested it bears similarities to a modern game, cribbage. You may know better. Possibly there was some carryover through the years. And another game, which is even more widespread and includes some modern variants throughout the Middle East and Northern Africa, is called Tab. And that is another track and dice game, but the play is different. The board is a bit different as well. It may have more or fewer squares than 30. But the pawns chase one another around the track, trying to land on one another and eliminate each other from the board. It's more of a capture game, as opposed to, you'll see with Senet, which is more of a race game, and with less emphasis on capture and removal of tokens. In fact, in the variant I'll discuss, pieces are never removed from the board, simply knocked backward if they're caught. So speaking of variants, I'll mention the one that I'm using here is created by Dr. Timothy Kendall in 1978 in a scholarly pamphlet where he described the evidence known at the time, gave his own ideas for a reconstruction of the game, building on prior reconstructions and trying to make them more playable, but still incorporating evidence that was available from, again, those literary references and images, which included some board positions. So you had an idea of how the game might turn out, just like you have positions in chess that are a reference to where you got to their different sets of moves. That's what he used as similar evidence on Senet. That's just one of several variants out there, but it is generally the most popular, Kendall's variant. In fact, if you find a computer game version or a commercial board game version of Senet, it probably is using the Kendall rules. There's actually a version on Steam if you'd like to check that out. So that gives you a general idea of what type of game it was. Now I can tie that into its cultural and spiritual significance. This may have been tied in with Senet from its very beginning. given its name, or it may have been something that was attached later, just as chess has taken on more literary and cultural significance over the years, as more references are made to it and as it's considered for its different metaphors. However, Senet was, again, deeply tied into religious mythology and culture. As I mentioned, the way that it depicts the movement of a soul through the afterlife. So much so that if you've ever heard of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, there is a ritual in there for the play of Senet that gives it spiritual power and significance. It's a form of magic. It could be used to help the sun along in its passage through the underworld as a kind of sympathetic magic, or similarly to help a particular soul on its journey through the underworld. Again, as the play of the game proceeded, so the soul was thought to be helped along. The board itself could be used to help the deceased. As I mentioned, they were found in tombs frequently. That was because not only was this a sort of talisman to ward off problems, but could actually be played by the deceased. And you know that grave goods were included in tombs of that type as something for the deceased to do in the afterlife, just like household items were included in foods. However, there are literary references that say that the game could be played by the deceased, by their soul, against other beings, against the gods, against spirits, against other creatures of the underworld, to ensure the spirit's survival and progress, possibly with rewards for winning such as immortality or reincarnation, helping them move past those dangers. The soul was also thought to be able to play against itself. There's at least one reference to play between the Ba and the Ka. Again, if you know your Egyptian mythology, these were different parts of a single being's soul, with the Ba being the sort of personal self soul, more like what we would think of as a soul, and the Ka being the motive, energetic part that enabled life and existence. Now, I wasn't clear on what happens with if the Ba versus the Ka wins the game. Maybe they just help each other by playing. But there's more in the writings of a Dr. Peter Piccione. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I've included the name in the description for reference. He's written several scholarly papers on the literary and historic references to Senet, describing these kinds of examples. There was another use of Senet that was interesting that's seen referenced. That is, the dead could play against the living. So it was a form of communication, of necromancy, to hear messages from the dead or to receive omens. And again, I don't know if that was through the throw of the sticks, how they came up, whether one player versus another one, or even just the overall progress of one or both players through the game could tell you something about perhaps how the dead is doing in their afterlife journey, or any messages that they have to pass on from the other side. But again, the fact that this existed and is well referenced indicates that the game was, tied deeply into the cultural aspects and this idea of passage through the underworld. All right, I think I've discussed enough about why the game was interesting and why it interested me. Let's get into the actual play and how someone would play at least Kendall's reconstruction. All right, for setup and play of the game, we'll look at the board itself rather than at my face. As I mentioned before, the setup of the board is specific and distinctive. And if you can't find a board online or in a game, you can draw your own, just as I've done. These are 1-inch squares. And again, there are 30 squares. They're numbered from 1 to 30 in 3 rows of 10 squares. So starting here at the top left is square 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right to left. Then from right to left, 11 to 20. Then from left to right again, 21 to 30. And again, I'll refer to these as houses, as in Kendall's writing. On the board, 5 squares are marked distinctively with, in this case, hieroglyphics. 15, 26, 27, 28, and 29. And these are houses that are given specific names. I'll discuss toward the end what those houses are called and what effects they have on gameplay. but that's one of the variations that makes it more than a straight race. In addition to the board, you'll need playing pieces or pawns. 2 different colors, 7 of each color. And in the rules, they're described as being light and dark. In this case, I've used light is orange, dark is blue. Those are set up on the board on the squares from 1 to 14, with the light-colored pawns on square or house number 1 and every odd-numbered house, so 1, 3, 5, and so forth, and the dark-colored pawns on house 2 and every even-numbered, 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. This is the initial setup of the game, which is always the same. You'll want to decide which player is going to be dark and which is light, either by mutual agreement, or you can roll the dice. There's a few different methods for choosing. Note that the player who gets the light color will be playing first. Finally, you do need some kind of random number generator, as I mentioned before. You can use a standard 6-sided die and just subtract 1 from the roll, and then you get a roll of 0 to 5. You can use sticks like I described. Make 4 of them with one side marked, one side blank, or one side dark and one side light, and throw those. Or you can actually use things like a 10-sided die and divide by 2, rounding down. Again, this gives you slightly different odds. It's harder to get a 5, but you can try that and see if you like the play better. All right, once you're set up, you're ready to play, and again, the light-colored player goes first. The basic rules of play are very simple. 1 at a time, turn by turn, players take turns rolling the die once or throwing the sticks, getting their number, and then choosing which piece to move. Now I've rolled 2 on the die, so again, subtracting 1, that's a roll of 1. Most of the strategy in the game is choosing which pawn to move when you've got multiple options available. So I could move, say, this one, or any of them, as if I'm the starting light-colored player. However, there are a number of rules that restrict the movement of pawns. I'm going to set up a sample board position with that roll. One of the rules is you cannot move a pawn onto a space or house already occupied by a pawn of the same color. So if I rolled a 1, I cannot move this pawn from 15 to 16 because there's already a pawn of that same color on that house. I could move this one, I could move one of my others, but not this one. Next rule. If a pawn moves on to a house already occupied by a pawn of the opposite color, that is an attack, and the 2 pieces swap positions. So with a move of 1 in this board position, I could move from 9 to 10 onto the opposite color. The dark pawn moves back to 9, and I take space 10. Or over here, we'll say dark has rolled 4. They could move to up to 15, kick the light pawn back to house 12, and they now occupy 15. That's an attack. It's a viable option. However, that gets complicated by the next rule. If none of your pawns can use the roll to move forward, as may be the case by being blocked by their own pieces or by the effects of the different houses, again to be discussed later, then you must move a pawn backward by that number of spaces. So say I was in that kind of situation, I couldn't move the token forward, say being blocked, I have to move one space backward instead. Note that you can attack backward also, which is doubly unfortunate. So we'll say in this case, this dark piece is forced to go backward. It's not in this board setup, but I'm just using it as an example. They still attack backward. They still push the light piece forward to their previous house. That gets into the next rule. If there is any legal move, even if it's a bad one, the player must take at least one move based on their role. Choose one of the options they have remaining. If they can move forward and they just don't like that they're moving forward, they may have to use that move instead. So the only exception is if none of the player's pawns can legally move forward or backward, then the player does not move at all and their turn ends. As you'll see as we go through an example of play, there may be cases where a player is stuck and has no legal moves or has no good legal moves. And they'll have to take one of the other options. Now, the last movement rule has to do with house 30. If a pawn reaches house 30 or would go past it based on its role, it does not go any further. It simply stops there. That's the final house of the board. The piece stops and ends its turn. If at the beginning of their next turn, a player has a pawn on house 30, that pawn is removed from the board. It exits. The goal of play is to exit all of your pawns, to get them all to house 30 and take them off the board in the next turn. Now you'll notice that sitting there for a turn means it's potentially vulnerable. So if a piece is sitting here on house 26 and that player rolls a 4, they can attack house 30, kick the light player back to 26 and take that. If that piece can remain there and it's not attacked on its own, it'll get to exit instead. So there's another layer of strategy and complexity. Now, that's, again, the basic rules of movement. They get complicated by, first of all, the houses, which change movement and affect roles. I'll describe that next. There are also some alternate rules, some of which were mentioned by Kendall, some of which were added from other variants or by other reconstructors later. Those can change whether moves are legal or not, and whether attacks are legal or not. So we can make the game more and more complex as we go on, and more strategic. Now that we've talked about the basic rules for movement, let's talk about the special squares on the board, the marked houses. You might think of these as special squares, the ancestors of such game effects as lose your next turn, or move 3 spaces forward, or 3 spaces back. They have certain effects on gameplay and of the movement of pawns. So let's start with the first in order, House 15, sometimes called the House of Life or the House of Rebirth. It's marked on this game board with the Ankh, which was called the Key of Life, a symbol of particular significance culturally and spiritually. This is the return space. Essentially, it's treated as the first space of the game proper. That's because if pawns land on House 27, the House of Waters, they are reborn. They are washed away and restart the game from this square. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the House of Waters. The next in order, however, house of significance, is the House of Happiness, which is marked with the hawk, which is another hieroglyph, and it also has representations of the god Horus, son of Osiris, a god of rulership, kingship. You can think of this as a point of review where souls passing through must stop to be recognized by the king. The hawk represents the Ba, the part of the soul that carries on, that is the individual self, the personal soul. So it has that double significance as a marking. Pawns must land on this space to progress any further, and they cannot move past it first. That is, when a pawn is approaching House 26, the House of Happiness, they must make the exact roll needed to land on it. So in this case, if I rolled a 4, 5 minus 1, I'm not going past that. I cannot use that roll to move this pawn. At some point, hopefully, I will get a 1 on one of my turns, in which case now I can move on to the House of Happiness I've met that requirement and can progress further on future turns. Note that this causes other effects. You can certainly attack onto the House of Happiness, but you again have to have rolled that exact number. If you already have a piece on the House of Happiness, not only can you not move on to it yourself, you cannot move past it because you would have to land on that space first. All right. Next house to note, next important marked square, is, as I mentioned, 27, the House of Water. And this is depicted by wave symbols, which is also a hieroglyph. In this case, has several meanings. It is the sound n, which is also the first sound in the name of the Nile. So it represents the river as well, and the sense of flooding, of washing away. And it also means to or toward as a semantic meaning for that sign. Pawns which land on 27, house 27, are washed away. They are considered unworthy or unready and are sent back to the beginning of the afterlife, the House of Rebirth, appropriately named. If house 15 is open, the pawn is simply sent back. So you can guess you probably don't want to land on house 27, the House of Water, but sometimes you're forced to, as we discussed before. If you have a roll that you have to use, you end up there, you move back here. It's important to note that only one pawn can be on 15, the House of Rebirth. So what do I do if I have a second pawn land on the House of Water? In this case, the pawn is set aside. It's said to be awaiting rebirth. This is a separate set from those that have exited. That piece will wait until house 15, the House of Rebirth, is open again. Once it's open, at the start of a turn, to use the roll, let's use an example. Say we've rolled a 6 minus 1 is 5. I can use that roll by landing on the House of Rebirth and then moving my 5 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's fine. That's considered a legal move. You return from been reborn and can move. Here's a complication. You cannot attack to or after starting from the House of Rebirth. Think of it as the soul is unable to attack. So if an opponent's piece is on the House of Rebirth, I cannot be reborn. And again, let's say I rolled that 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. An opponent's token is here. I cannot be reborn and then move to attack them. So that's not going to be a legal move. So a couple of extra rules with the House of Waters moving to the House of Rebirth. It's possible, with enough misfortune, that you'll have multiple pawns waiting to be reborn. They're going to have to keep waiting until that space is open on their turn. All right, the next house and another challenge is here, house 28, the House of Three Truths. It's represented on this board, Kendall's board, with 3 dots, which is a particular hieroglyph as well. However, often this is depicted as as 3 feathers, representing the feather of Maat, which is the Egyptian goddess of truth, justice, judgment, and order. Again, from Egyptian mythology, when a spirit passes through the underworld, it reaches a point where it's judged. Its heart is weighed by Anubis, the god of the dead, and compared to the feather of Maat to see which is lighter. If the heart is heavier, weighed down with sins, it is considered unworthy. That soul will not be reborn or be allowed immortality, and the heart is discarded, tossed to a creature which consumes it. If it's lighter than the feather, they may pass on. So you can think of the House of Three Truths as a trial that your pawn must undergo. How do they pass the trial? Well, fortunately, if they can't pass it, they're not destroyed, but they're just stuck there until they roll 3. House of Three Truths, you got to roll a 3. So 4 minus 1 on my die. If that's managed, the piece moves not 3 houses, but just the 2 to the final house, house 30, in which case it will be able to exit on the next turn if it stays there. However, roll anything else, you can't move that pawn. It is stuck there until you get a 3, at which point you can move it. Couple things to note. Can I attack to the House of Three Truths? Absolutely. That piece now will be stuck here for trial until it's either attacked or it manages to get off. Can I attack from the House of Three Truths? Definitely. Roll a 3. You end up here. That counted as an attack. Okay. Explaining that space makes it much easier to explain the final house. House 29, the House of the Re Atum. That is depicted with the hieroglyph, the Eye of Horus, which you may recognize as often used as a talisman, a ward against evil. In a similar sense, this is a blockade, a ward against anything that is evil or untoward. It's a protective space. And there's a trial here as well. A pawn that lands on space 29 has to roll a 2 in order to escape. So you'll keep rolling. Eventually, rolling a 2, the space piece moves again, straight to the final space, house 30, and awaits its exit. Anything else, any other roll, and you cannot exit that piece. Oh, an important addition. Besides the fact that, yes, you can attack a piece that's here, you can attack from house 29, as with 28. Those rules, that is, having to roll a 3 to move forward, having to roll a 2 to move forward, only apply to forward movement. If it occurs that you must move a piece backward, and a piece on either of these houses is the only piece that you can move backward, you can move backward any number of spaces, because it doesn't help you in your journey. So we'll say, for example, that someone's stuck here, that's their only pawn on the board, and they roll something other than a 3. Well, they can't move forward, so they're going to move backward. And I rolled a 1. So that means they're going to the House of Waters. See, I mentioned there are some ways that you'd end up on the House of Waters even if you didn't want to. So that's forced backward. Well, it's back to 15 for this pawn. Rebirth. No one said that the journey through the underworld was easy. And in fact, this back and forth kind of bureaucratic nature is thought by some writers to be intentional, that it was meant to be a part of the game and a part of its spiritual significance. Players could get frustrated for minutes and hours until they get a good roll to get out. Maybe that's part of your omen. Now, in addition to the basic movement and rules and the houses, there are some additional rules which are not specifically used in Kendall's game, but have been suggested by other variants and other reconstructions before and after to make things more interesting, to put more of the strategy of the game in the hands of the players by controlling the movement of opponents' pieces as well as your own. So let's look at some of those variants to conclude. I've discussed the basic rules of the game, how moves can and can't be made, how the houses affect those movements and the play of the game. There are some additional rules that have been used in other variants of Senet before and after Kendall's rules, and some that Kendall discusses, that you might like to include individually or in combinations. I'd suggest playing the game through once with the basic rules to see how it goes and how you like it, and then deciding what variants you want to add in. The first variant rule is rerolls. In this variation, anytime a player rolls a 1 or a 5 or 6, depending on how you're using the die or the throwing sticks, but the highest and lowest rolls, excuse me, I put a 0, should be 1 or 5, that player then re-rolls. So for example, if I roll a 1 on the first roll, I can then re-roll another 1, re-roll. Hey look, a 5, re-roll, and now a 4, so I stop re-rolling. So keep those separate as you count them. 1, 1, 6, 4. You can use all of those rolls as long as they're legal for a single pawn. So I could do, say for example, 1, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, well I can't do that last one because house here. So I'd have to split it up. I move the 6, and then I move 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, you can use them all on the same pawn if it's legal to do so, or you may move multiple pawns. I could even do, with those 4 different rolls, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. Also legal. But again, as in the basic rules, you must use each roll if possible. And even if you end up having to make a negative move, backward or to a space you didn't want to move to, that's how it goes. So sometimes rerolls are useful, sometimes not so much. Especially if you get toward the end of the game and you say have only 1 pawn remaining, you may not be able to use one or any of those rolls. Note that as soon as you hit one of those rolls that you cannot use for any moves, useful or detrimental, your turn stops there. So again, maybe some of those rerolls will be wasted, but it is an option and it's much more interesting early on, choosing amongst your pieces and splitting up those rolls. So that's one of the optional variants you might want to try. The second variant is called defense. That rule says that if 2 pawns of the same color are on adjacent houses, adjacent squares, neither may be attacked. So let's say these 2 pawns are in these 2 adjacent houses, and blue, dark, has rolled a 3. It cannot move this piece to attack here because it is defended by its ally. This gives an incentive for players to move pawns together in groupings in order to maintain that defense, rather than having, say, one pawn race ahead and try to get to the end, use all its rolls to get to right to the final square. And of course, at some point, those pawns may have to break up that defense in order to use a roll, but it gives another option to protect pawns from being attacked. The last variant, and again, these are separate and can be used separately, this is blockade. That rule says that if 3 pawns of the same color are on 3 adjacent squares, and I'll note also that adjacent squares includes around corners. So 19, 20, and 21 is as much a blockade as, say, 16, 17, 18. Just a note. But when they're together like that, pawns of the opposing color cannot move past them. They are blockading that movement. So we'll say, for example, the pawns are laid out like this. Blue rolls or dark rolls a 4. It cannot move past these to that 4th space, even though it's open. And again, that's another limiter on movement. And it's a reason that players may want to move their pawns together, keep them grouped together, to create these blockades, to lock off opposing pawns in the other side of the board. Note that, again, these rules are separable. So it's possible, if you're only using the blockade rule, but not the defense rule, that blue could move to attack. Say it rolls a 2, it can attack, swap places, and break that blockade. Whereas if you're using both the defense and the blockade rules, now not only can the other color not move past those spaces, it also cannot attack them. So, together, that creates a powerful tool for players to control parts of the board. And as I mentioned before, these options, reroll, defense, and blockade, give a little bit more of a chance for strategic movement of choices between different moves, rather than the game being so much in the control of the dice themselves. So, give it a try. You can try the basic game. You can try the more complex versions. See if you like that added layers of strategy and complexity. And of course, note that all these rules are going to interact with the houses. So it gives additional chances to have non-legal moves or undesirable moves. So something to consider. And that is the game of Senet, or at least the Kendall variant. As I mentioned before, try the game, see how it plays for you. You may want to try some of the variant rules as well. Normally in these videos, I would play through a sample game, but I'm not going to do that in this case because, as I might have noted, a game can take just a few minutes or it can take hours. And this is considered by some a flaw of Senet, that with all the blockages and back and forth and specific rules, it can be rather tedious. Some consider this a virtue or an intentional feature, as for the Egyptian dead, the transit through the underworld and through the afterlife may not be so smooth. There may be obstacles and complications involved. It may be that a game that lasts that long is meant to do so. However, again, you can try variations. You may want to consider variant rules for finishing a game. If it goes longer than you have time available, you might want to have the first player who exited a token be the winner, or the player who has exited the most pawns after a given time frame. But again, I hope you enjoyed and liked this description, and I'm going to hope that your games don't take an eternity to make the passage.